Hi there. So previously we discussed on the architecture of this project and we mentioned that we will be running Spark on top of EMR cluster. So in this video let's look at the setup for EMR and Spark. So to get started, first we'll need to have a cluster. So if you don't have one, you can easily create it from the EMR console, and for that you can just go with the quick options. If you are not sure there, you can just choose the Spark, and if you are going to use glue data catalog for high meta store, you can choose this option, or if you don't want to use glue, you can just leave this as it is. Next we will choose the instance type that we want to use for our nodes and the number of nodes that we want. And we can also choose cluster scaling if you want to scale the cluster automatically. Lastly, we'll need to choose the EC2 pair, which will be used for SSH into the nodes, and the IAM roles that will be attached to the cluster. Mainly we are concerned for this role because this is the role that will be attached to all of our instance or nodes, and our application will be basically getting credentials for this role. So the permissions required for our application will need to be assigned here, and for default ones, basically all the permissions are allowed, so we don't need to worry about this. Whereas if we were to use custom role, then we need to ensure the permissions in this section. And if you are familiar with EMR, then you can also go further with advanced options. So before I get started with the actual ETL job, I generally prefer to start with other tools. So it can be either your CLI, for example, or PySpark shell, or it can be notebooks. We have two options for notebook, which are Zeppelin and Jupyter, or we can also use Hue editor, so that we have a graphical interface to interact with Hive, Presto, or Spark SQL that are running in the EMR cluster. So for the CLI part, so we first just do a SSH into our master node, and in the master node, to launch the PySpark shell, the command is just PySpark. So it will take few minutes to launch the application, and once it is ready, we can interact with PySpark shell. Similarly for using notebooks, if you were to use Zeppelin notebook, you'll need to ensure that Zeppelin is installed while launching the cluster itself, and then you will access the Zeppelin UI through a port hosted in the master node. So for that, you may need to have either SS tunneling or a direct connect or VPN to your VPC. Whereas with Jupyter Notebook, EMR has a different section for notebook, and the notebook can be attached to any of your cluster that has Hadoop, Spark, and Livy installed. So I personally prefer this method because of this feature, so that it is not tied to any cluster and it can be easily changed to another cluster if required. So to go with the Jupyter notebook, so we just select the notebook, attach it to a cluster, and once it is ready, we just open the Jupyter Lab console. So the interface for it looks like this. So I also have few notebooks here, and as you can see, like I have several cells and even the output. So while testing or working with team, this is a very handy tool to utilize. So the way I launched this notebook was simply from launcher. So since I'm going to use PySpark, I just use the PySpark here, and that would use the kernel PySpark. That is all we need to do, and we can get started with writing and testing our codes. Lastly, for the Hue, it is also accessed through your master node. So in my case, I'm doing a SSH tunnel like I mentioned, and I have a proxy to access other ports in the master node. And for SSH, I'm simply doing something like SSH tunneling like this, and then the proxy will listen on the port 8157, and then I can access other ports from my browser. So as you can see, I have several tables here, and for example, I'm currently in Hive. I can switch to other applications. So this is also a very good tool to use. And lastly, I also want to briefly talk about the application interfaces available in EMR cluster. So I have SSH tunneling established and proxy running. These are the on-cluster user interfaces we can utilize depending on what we need to access. So for now, I'll just open Spark and Yarn. So the Yarn UI looks something like this, and you can get the overall cluster metrics and the applications running. So this can be very handy if you are trying to monitor the Yarn performance or resources. Similarly, since we are using Spark application, uh, it is also very handy to use Spark UI to analyze what is going on with our application or if there is any room for optimization. So for Spark, depending on which YAML cluster version you are using, we have two types of interfaces. So this one that I'm showing is the on-cluster user interface, and this is the one I'm showing. So the only difference between this and the persistent one is here, and it is opened in this tab. So the difference we can see is that the event log directory is S3 for the persistent one, whereas on cluster UI it is hosted in SDFS. So since it is in SDFS, if this cluster is terminated, this event log will also go away. So this UI can't be accessed for a terminated cluster, whereas the persistent UI will be stored in S3. So even after your cluster is terminated, this one will be available. So depending on your use case, you might want to use either of them. And for the notebook templates, I have also put them in the GitHub repository if you want to take a look and try out. So yeah, that's it for this video. Till then, take care.